So let's get started. First of all, I would like to welcome you to strengthening our supply agreements, understanding them. Within this presentation, we're going to go through a few elements of it. Hopefully, everyone here will be able to take some nuggets out of this presentation. So thank you again. Initially, let's tell you a little bit about myself. My name is Curtis Jingles. I've been doing this for a number of years within the pharmaceutical industry. I've been in leadership for about 15 years, from various roles to business development, quality, manufacturing, R&D, sales roles. I've done it from Hospira, DSM, and now Jubilant. So it is important to, I guess you would say, grasp the understanding of each role within a supply agreement because everyone has a stake in this process. So a supply agreement in itself, it is a binary document. Binary meaning because we have two parties that are involved in this. Essentially, two companies are coming together. In essence, I would venture to say it's sort of a marriage between two companies. So it's important that you understand that within a marriage, you have various family members who have roles in the process. Within a supply agreement, each company has various roles within their own companies that want a part of this process. So you need to understand that it is a binary, it's a two-way document. Let me try this. Agreement, as I said, between two parties. It's key understanding of that. The intent of the supply agreement is to resolve and anticipate issues long before they occur. No one ever intends on having a document that has issues with it or issues that may occur, but you have to anticipate those. So as a result, you need to think ahead. You need to think in detail what could go wrong. So in essence, you almost have to become a forecaster of what's the worst case scenario. And this communication should be very collegial, meaning that it shouldn't be one party imposing its will upon the other one, because you have to establish that, it's been cliched now, the win-win document. You have to establish wins for both parties. So therefore, communication has to be clear, has to be concise, expectations set ahead of time. It is important, especially now with this, given, I guess you would say, higher regulatory expectations, that while this is going on, while you are negotiating, communicating the expectations of your supply agreement, that you're also looking at the quality agreement. These should go on in parallel. They should be very independent of each other, but as we know, the quality agreement will be housed within the supply agreement. And I say once again, this is never meant to be easy. Supply agreements should not be an easy document. They should be very difficult because you're thinking about what could go wrong and preparing both parties of the expectations. The unfortunate side of these things is that the way the normal process has worked in the past is that you initially look for who can manufacture your drug, and then you determine if they have the adequate quality, and then everyone rushes through the supply agreement. And this is one of the most important documents you have because it binds the relationship. But not enough time is adequately spent on defining this document. So what are the roles? What are the different roles that you're expecting as you look at the pharmaceutical provider? You're asking them to provide me expertise. Well, expertise in what? In the manufacturing process. You're also looking for expertise in the distribution chain. You're also looking for expertise in understanding the commodities and the reactions of those commodities as they interact with the drug compound in itself. So provide me with expertise. And you're also saying, from a drug manufacturer, the CMO standpoint, give me resources. The market changes. I don't understand what my drug is going to do. I know what I want it to do, but I don't want to take my fixed assets, my variable assets, and change them into fixed assets. So therefore, I'm looking at outsourcing this drug. So I need for you to provide adequate resources because I cannot anticipate the market fluctuation on my drug. And you're also looking at cost savings, something that is very seldom discussed during the supply agreement stage. What are going to be some of the aspects going forward? Because we know that people are driving prices down. How can we build in this supply agreement a mechanism for recognizing cost reduction? Everyone at this point in time should have black belts on staff, green belts. We have products, we have projects, and those should be yielding some cost reductions. Well, how can we recognize that? Because we want to maintain your drug to be competitive in the marketplace, so we have to look at ways without, I guess you would say, putting at risk any quality aspects, cost reduction. But those aspects need to be discussed up front and how we're going to capture them. So what is the CMO looking for from the drug manufacturer? Well, of course, we're looking to understand what is the formulation, what does it do? Understanding the aspects of it, because there are certain things that you saw early in your development on your bench studies that we would not have, the CMO would not have be privy to understand. As we begin to take in your DMF and bring that in the house, there are certain aspects that your DMF may not capture. So there should be this collegial communication about what would a drug do. And there's also the aspects of the supply chain. Well, initially, you brought your drug into the States. Most likely, your drug, your API, came from outside of the United States. Very few APIs are still manufactured here within the States, where there's some things about the supply chain that you understand that the CMO may not understand initially. It could be cold chain storage. It could be chain of custody, how it's coming in. All of that needs to be communicated in order for us to ensure that there are security and supply as we go along in the process. And the two should have a seamless integration between the two. As the agency and others look at the partnership, it should be seamless. It shouldn't be, I paid you to manufacture drugs, so go manufacture it. Or we are a service provider, so all we do is manufacture. We don't concern ourselves with the upstream process. That's not what the agency is looking for. And those, I guess you would say, exchange for goods relationships will no longer last, I guess you would say, exponentially in the process, long term. So with the agreement of role, both parties, we need to set the expectations. And when I say set the expectations, as I've been through close to, and I was estimating this last night, close to 200 different supply agreements. Some have ranged from, I think the highest one was about $120 million, all the way down to a little less than $15,000. As I've been through, and each one of them are unique in itself, the ones that I have seen fail, it came down to the expectations. What was the expectation? The expectation, you were supposed to do this. We were expecting this from you. And it always goes down to that. But there's very little time when you are doing the supply agreement or negotiating or communicating about the supply agreement that those conversations take place. So you need to set the expectations early in the process, but also you need to discuss the capabilities. Years ago when I started my career, and I do mean years ago, I've been doing this now for close to 25 years, everyone anticipated that ampules would go out. We thought that when we nitrogen purged over top of a tank into the process, driving gas out, that was state of the art. Well, now we are putting in preservatives and oxygen scavengers in the formulation, and we are now finding new ways. We have taken oxygen out. We have went away to some degree with amber amber lighting and glass, we're turning, so technologies and capabilities change. It's important that the communication in both sides are acknowledging that, in the sense that as you begin to take on the next phase of your drug, whether your drug is in a pre-filled syringe or whether your drug is in some other dosage form, that those communications are dual. And you're understanding that, and you're communicating with both parties are looking at this as a long-term relationship. And also, one of the key aspects of this is lessons learned. We have to be willing to share lessons learned. Lessons learned typically means that something has failed in the process, that something has failed, and sometimes failure is embarrassing. So when failure is embarrassing, people tend to not want to share that. But the lessons learned in the process means that you have to set aside what you want and think of the long-term viability of the relationship, of the product, and of both companies. So we need to make sure we're sharing our lessons learned. So we're going to go through a few elements of what is in the supply agreement. Once again, I'm starting off with risk allocation. This is not all-encompassing, but I wanted to capture some of the main things. The second one is the supply of materials and forecasts, and the liability of excess and obsolescent components. I want to make sure that we are capturing some of the things that become sticking points along the way within a relationship that are very, very seldom discussed when you are negotiating the initial supply agreement. Payment terms, price increases, and mechanisms for credit limits. How do you discuss that? Because everyone is trying to now, since 2007 actually, there's been a whole new rush on cash management, preserving cash flow. So cash flow accounting has pushed its way heavily in the pharmaceutical industries. Limits of liability, indemnification, deliveries, minimum purchases, quality assurance, and cost of changes, additional services, and governing law. This list is not all-encompassing within itself. There are certain elements of this that are higher than others, and this is in no way a Pareto of how these things should go through. Because once again, we know that quality is paramount, but if you talk to someone from purchasing, they will tell you forecasts and things of that nature are the key. You talk to someone from your insurance, legal, they will tell you that limits of liability. So once again, this list in itself is not meant to be, this is the order that you have to negotiate these things. The process for both parties to predict events, you can't predict events that are unimaginable. It's hard to know what's going to occur before it occurs. I mean, for example, no one would ever think that if I ran my ampule vials through an ISI or nicotine that something in my drug in itself, it would cause an impurity to show up. Well, no one would know that because during the development stage, you didn't use those processes. You didn't realize that. Well, if you look at the CMO, or even if there's internal manufacturing, you wouldn't know that until it was further in the supply chain and you begin to see something that showed up. I guess you would say, have experienced some of those items, and you begin to look and you begin to, okay, well, the supply agreement didn't discuss this. How do we cover this? So that's where the communication, that's where you get into the very, I guess you say, minutia of the details of language that covers both parties. So, for example, how are you going to handle your failure of API? Manufacturing process or the chain in itself. No one ever wants to discuss this because everyone wants to believe that these things can never occur. And we all know that when we start dealing with this can never occur, it occurs. So in the giving communication, you need to make sure we're communicating of how we're going to deal with these things. Supply agreement in itself, as I stated earlier, and I want to emphasize this point, should be gone through with an enormous amount of time, energy, and detail. You should go through them. You should take your time and go through them. And I can tell you, if once they are agreed upon, they should be put on the shelf and should not be looked at anymore until it's time for renewal. Because if you have to pull them down beforehand, you have failed at the relationship. The relationship has failed. Because every time that something occurs and you pulling the supply agreements, you discuss who's at fault, then you, on the other end, both parties have failed. So once again, they should be gone through with enormous amounts of detail from the beginning and then placed on the shelf. Now, if you have to take it down, then you still have to question how and why. Typically, what ends up happening, and what I have seen over the years, and this is with various companies, is that when we talked earlier about the expectation, we were expecting this or we were expecting that. That's the part that always comes up, where we were expecting you to handle this in this manner, and you didn't do that. That's why you should have quarterly, semi-annually conversations at the executive levels to make sure that both parties are meeting their expectation. That's how you preserve the relationships. And you have to have honest dialogue. We feel that you could do better in this area. We want you to look at this. So that honest dialogue and people setting aside their personal desires becomes, I guess you would say, mute to preserving the relationship. And it's not a matter of if things occur, it's a matter of when they occur and how you're going to handle them. Because what ends up happening, and what I've seen in most cases of supply agreements, is that in cases where the relationship has been preserved, there has been, including there's been issues on both sides. I've seen where the provider has had issues with black box warnings. I have seen where the provider have had API issues. I have seen on the CMO side, and since I've been on this side of the business, I have seen issues in the manufacturing process. And where the examples, I can say the relationship was preserved, there was an immediate response on both parties on getting things back in track. Where the relationships has failed, there has been an immediate turn of, let me protect my own, and therefore the product has been off the market in some cases, and product has been challenged because the relationship has failed. And then you begin to see the meetings of the attorneys of saying, well, what is our exposure? When those types of elements should have never had to occur if the relationship has been preserved. Supply agreements, as we talked earlier, they can be singular in nature or they could be multi-level. I like to use the approach of situational negotiations, where you begin to frame whatever element within the supply agreement you're working on, and you try to make sure that you're capturing the essence of what you are doing. Because as you know, from the quality side, they have very, very good parameters they want to make sure they preserve. Where your finance guys, your CFOs, they want to make sure they preserve margin and price and things of that nature. And then your manufacturing guys, they want to set it up and run it and never stop running it. So everyone has a stake in this. So if you use what I call situational negotiations, you can capture the essence of what each party wants, representing each company from the CMO side, also from the drug product manufacturer owner side. So with that being said, the overall relationship that the product owner provides between the product and the provider, while the two parties are doing business, you need to understand, why are we with CMO A? Why is drug product manufacturer B a good partner for us? Some of those conversations need to be held long before you get where you are in the process. Because if it's not a good fit culturally, it's not a good fit, I guess you say, from a company standpoint, from values going forward, These are the areas that you're going to begin to see these show up in. And the next one, what are the financial benefits of both? You need to make sure that we give a pricing or the product on the market is competitive with the other product that it competes against. No one I know has developed a drug that has no competitors in the market. If they do, then they won't be there no more than 7 years. And there's no CMO that's in business, I guess you would say, under the premise that they're not going to be profitable. So it's important for both parties to look at the financial aspects of it, to make sure that both parties feel that they're getting a fair price and the service level is actually beyond the expectation. You don't want to meet the service level, you want to exceed those. So one of the common areas that seem to come up during these supply agreements conversations is the volume and volume commitments. CMO needs the volume commitments in order to ensure that second element of resources, understanding and making sure that in case your product ramps up, there's adequate resources to handle that volume. In case the product goes down, we CMOs don't want to lay off people because that doesn't help anyone long term. Well, from the drug provider concept, if you look at this, you don't want to provide those type of commitments because there's other variables in the marketplace that you can't predict. You don't know if Medicare is going to accept those payments if there's an alternate drug out there that's cheaper. You don't know if there's going to be a black box warning. You don't know there's other aspects of who is bringing what to the marketplace that may compete with your drug. So there's a tendency, let's stay away from volume commitments because we don't want to know. And the CMO is saying, I need this to be very predictable from the resource standpoint in order to, so it becomes, I would venture to say, a little bit contentious in nature by the very thing because both parties want different things. Well, I would venture to say you should look at the happy medium. For example, you want to say, well, I tell you what, let's meet not on the full value of your, I guess you would say, forecast. Let's do half. In addition to that, let's look at saying if we ramp up, let's say give us so much time to ramp this up or ramp down. That's where the relationships comes into play because we want to make sure that if you're doing situational negotiation, you understand what both parties need during this process. So one of the examples is we begin to allow CMOs in this process because there are certain elements you can't control. For example, labels, components. Some of the components have extended lead times. For example, glass in itself, if you have a special glass, a special vial that you're developing, some of those components are 12 to 15 months lead time. Now, I'm going to give you an example. About 2009, some would say that was the beginning of the housing crash, but if something occurred around that time period, we saw gas go up over $4 a gallon in most states. Well, that had an extenuating circumstance upon everything that you and I do for a living. It drove up our commodity costs. It drove up transportation. It drove everything up. Well, those costs, the hospitals were not willing to bear. So how did we do? What did we do? Well, most of the supply agreements at the time didn't deal with that and tried to take care of this through a PPI annual adjustment. So part of this partnership, and the reason I say that you need to make sure there's constant dialogue, is that many supply agreements, many relationships during that time period got strained because of something, a variable that no one ever saw. Everyone saw gas going up. They saw gas and those things going up and never thought that they would stay up so long that it began to affect other elements of the business. And there was nothing in many supply agreements to deal with that aspect of it. So, as I said, you need to discuss and agree upon the lead times, the volume commitments, will risk mitigate and take place. A part of this, once again, as I say, is always communication. Open dialogue early in the process. Okay? Common concerns related to exclusivity. Well, of course, if I'm drug product owner X, I don't want you making anything that is even remotely close to my product. That's a common theme in supply agreement. These things become, to some degree, contentious a lot of times during the negotiation phase. I don't want you even, if the same APIs, any close to the indication, I don't even want you even looking at it. Matter of fact, I want you walking down the street by it. So you have those conversations. From the CMO standpoint, the CMO looks and says, hey, listen, I'm just a contract manufacturing organization. All I want to do is run it. I'm not trying to manufacture it for myself. I just want to run it. That's all I do. And then the conversation, well, I don't want you running it. I don't want you looking at someone else. So those conversations get a little bit testy at the time. So let me back up. So there's various ways I've dealt with some of these types of conversations in the past. It's situational, where you begin to, sometimes the language that you put in the contract begin to say, I'm not going to touch anything that even comes close to your product. The API can be used for other sources, but part of this is I need to, for example, if I'm running an API that's for another indication, I can't disclose that confidential information, but I can sign and say that I'm not going to use it for anything that's even remotely competes in your marketplace. The way that I have seen it done wrong is that I've seen loose language that doesn't address those issues, and then someone else begins to disclose that confidential information because they've moved on to another organization, and then that's when it becomes in a patent and things of that nature. So we need to make sure that the communication is very clear, very concise of how we're going to handle these things. So one of the areas that I would venture to say that most people don't spend a lot of time that you would think they would is in the pricing area. There's very little time spent on pricing. Conversations about pricing takes place during the initial phase of I would say, rounding about CMOs, whether, first of all, you go through your make-buy decision, whether you're going to make it in-house or go externally because you want to take that on fixed assets and turn it to a variable asset. And then you decide, well, what's the price? What's the price point based upon the other competitors in the marketplace? What are we looking at? And then the pricing, you go out, you find your CMOs, then it goes away. And that is short-term thinking. Very sensitive subject, but it has to be structured and communicated, because the pricing you have right now, if you have not thought long-term, then you have failed. You failed in what you need to do, because you're going to have price pressures that come in later on. That's why it was important earlier, as I presented about cost savings, you need to make sure that you're thinking not just for this short stanza in the phase, but also long-term, 3-5 years out. Because what ends up happening in most cases, in about 3 years, most drug manufacturers, and drug owners say that I need to reduce this pricing because I'm getting a lot of pressure from this company here because I'm competing. If you're not competing against someone now, you will be competing within the next 3 years. So I'm going to give you an example of a real company, real situation, where pricing was not discussed, but it became very paramount. So Company X created an effective drug cancer medication. What they didn't understand, that Medicare also had more drugs out there that they may not have had the same p-value, but they were very competitive in the sense of cost, and they were very competitive in the sense of pricing. So this Company X here, geared up, hired a bunch of people, and went bananas. The stock went through the roof to find out that the sales were not there because they didn't take the time to understand the pricing. So once again, when you look at pricing, you have to look at the beginning stages of the process all the way down through the manufacturing stage to make sure, not just for this brief moment, but long term. So I would suggest from a CMO standpoint, now I'm going to change gears again, CMOs, unfortunately, in that early process, CMOs are so, I guess you say, ecstatic to get the business. They're ready to set the price. Well, how many processes are the same as you quote by the time that you run your PVs and your development batches and you're running your 3 batches for submission? The process has evolved into something that may not meet the original scope. So what I would suggest ways to mitigate around that is that you look at setting the final price after several batches of commercial batches have been made. You can agree initially upon this is what we're going to charge here. And then once again, the communication, then you begin to look long term and says, okay, now let's lock this price down. This is what has happened since we gave you initial quote. The process has evolved to this. So now let's find the actual price that we're going to agree upon. So, key issues around the, as I stated, I've kind of sped through this, around price negotiation. We dropped the ball when we start thinking about self-interest. So what ends up taking place is the parties, as I said, there's many factors that are involved in this. Some who are saying, if I can just get it for this price right here, I'm okay. We'll be all right if we just get it for this price, and not thinking long term. So in the same breath, on the CMO side, you have to think outside of this short-term relationship. You have to start thinking 2 years from now, 3 years from now, first of all, this is a company that I want to be in business with. And is this company viable? Do they have a pipeline? Those elements come into play. And also, are we setting prices where we can meet expectations and also anticipate that we're going to be looking at several cost reduction initiatives that both parties are going to undertake? So pricing is a multi-pronged issue that you have to really dive into instead of spending the short period of time that most parties do. I'm saying, can we just agree upon this price? So, but in order for all of this to take place, we have to have a high level of disclosure. And that's where the trust comes into factor. You have to be willing to share. You know, at this point, we're not willing to go below our volumes or go below our commitments because we are no longer a profitable company long term. And you also have to be, I guess you would say, willing to, this may not sound very collegial, but walk away. If it's no longer a good fit for business, it's no longer a good fit for business for either parties. You have to be willing to look at that and say at some point in time, this no longer makes sense for either party. Invoicing, self-explanatory. You need to discuss this. Invoicing never becomes a contentious issue, but it becomes a nuisance, I would venture to say. It becomes, you know, that you send the invoice. When does the invoice have to be paid? Those types of conversations become nuisance. And you're saying, guys, why can't we, and you look at your purchasing guys, and you look at your commercial staff, and you say, why can't we just get this done? Let's just get, and it becomes almost a little nagging toothache, I would venture to say, if I want to explain it in that way. So, and right now, there's a huge push to go to 90-day terms. At one point in time, that was 30 days, and 60 days took place a couple years ago. Now I've seen 90 days. There was an article that was in the Bloomberg early last year that says that pharmaceutical companies were leaving so much money on the table because of actually Medicare and others were not paying within a given period of time, and pharmaceutical companies were not holding their vendors accountable to this, so therefore they were taking on all this cash flow issues. So now there's a huge push to take the 90-day terms. Well, those are all, even that can be negotiated. Meaning there's ways from a pricing standpoint for you to get around these things to make sure that both parties, their interests are protected. Termination agreements. No one wants to discuss this, but I think that this is a necessary step to protect both parties. So give you a couple reasons why you want to have it. Interruption of supply. If you're on the opposite side, if you have an interruption of supply, you want to make sure that you can't sell what ain't on the shelf. So you want to make sure you have a provision in there that protects against that. Inability for both parties to agree upon release criteria. You have a spec, it meets USP, you've agreed upon it, now you have tightened your provisions internally because of some internal issues or agencies, and you guys cannot agree. You need to have this in there to ensure that both parties are protected. Well, you're no longer competitively priced on either side, meaning that I'm selling it, I'm making it, but I'm selling it at a loss now because I've got volume commitments, you're forcing me to make it, so I can't do this, in essence. Terms of the contract are outdated and need to be resolved or dissolved. Both parties look at a termination agreement with their own interests in mind, creates an area of conflict. I would venture to say that from a termination agreement, it should never be the first thing you go to, or you never should ever threaten anything you're not fully capable of carrying out. I would venture to say it should be much communications around these things, meaning it should be a clause of last resort. You have sat down in several face-to-face meetings, you've tried to resolve it, you've tried to, including in some cases, sought mitigation, meaning you had a mediator between you two, and you tried to fix this issue and you can't resolve it, it should be used then, but only after you have exhausted all other alternatives. During negotiation phase, common termination agreement issues. During negotiation phase, there's certain criteria both parties, other side's viewpoint, but tissue issues might rise down the road, as I stated. Give you a couple examples of reasons why you want to look at this. Drug manufacturer wants you to decommission a filling line. Well, the line, you no longer, hypothetically, you no longer make ampules. You've got one product of ampules, and every time you run this line, it costs you money. Well, you may want to get out of this right now. Example 2, drug product owner wants to move the product to another site. All of a sudden, you've got all the other products some other place, and now I want to move this one last product because I want to reduce my internal resources of outsourcing personnel. So there are reasons why you may want to seek a termination agreement, but once again, it should be things that should be sought as a last resort, not the first thing. Okay, situation, common termination agreement issues. Most issues can be resolved with proper planning in the supply agreement. You can talk about them, get them done long before you get there. In the area of termination agreement, in both parties, you need to make sure that you allow adequate time for either the drug manufacturer, or even if you're on the drug manufacturer side, allow the company to find an alternative site. You should never, and I repeat this, you should never ever just implement a termination agreement without prior or adequate notification. Because the end result of everything that we do, we want to ensure that there's product on the market, and we never ever want to take that off our eyes off the ball in there. We're trying to protect patients. So you should never use this clause as a hammer. Think about the end user. So 18 months is the adequate time when you're looking at doing a termination agreement. You should negotiate that and have that conversation early in the process. Penalties for both sides, and once again, I'm going to use the modern day thing that's going on right now. Those of us who have flown in this area, we were told that sequestration was going to be the penalty for two parties, Democrats and Republicans, not agreeing on things. And it was going to be so bad that they would never look at this occurring. Well, you should have penalties in your supply agreement and for both parties to be protected, because you don't want either side using this termination agreement as a hammer. You never want to use it as a hammer. So you should have some penalties in there to make sure that, okay, if you want to use this, you can do it, but it needs to be severe enough that it should be the thing of last resort. So part of the termination should also have a escalation path, because if it has an escalation path, two parties may not agree because they may be emotionally tied to this, because this party is closer to it. If it has an escalation path, then the motion can be resolved, meaning two people looking completely outside determine, first of all, if these two companies want to work together. Liabilities. Liability is a major issue because something suddenly happened in the manufacturing process, throws a wrench in the works. That never happens if those of us who have spent half our careers in manufacturing, everything always goes off perfectly. They do not. One of the issues you want to say is loss of API. That becomes a major hot point for everyone, because the API is the most expensive I guess you say, element of the manufacturing process. Well, your manufacturing, whether it be internal or external, they don't want to pay for the API loss, because the API loss represents the margin, the profit, well over the margin of profit they're going to make. So you have to discuss these things and how you're going to handle them. Contractors are predisposed only to the cost of the product they're going to make. The APIs are well 5 times towards the manufacturing cost of goods. So you have to discuss how are you going to handle API. I could give some more nuggets of how I've handled these things over the contracts I have, but that would be disclosing too much confidential information. When there's the issue of nonconformance, the CMO has lost revenue. The drug product owner has lost not only the revenue, but also, once again, the API. And it's interesting, during the conversation of contracts, this becomes only if I had to Pareto the amount of time that is spent in this one element, I would venture to say it's less than 2%. It's less than 2%, but it's the most expensive part of the process. So once again, this is a very gray area that you have to address, and each circumstance may present various options. So I could give you some ideas of how to handle them, but you have to look at your circumstances, your company, and where you're going to get your drugs manufactured. Common issues around the liability, resolution of these gray areas, negotiation, supply agreement. Well, certain things you can look at, of course. You can always get insurance to cover throughout the chain of the process and pass that cost on. Or you can look at another option. You can actually look at increasing the forecast volumes. Because you increase forecast volumes, hopefully, if the CMO or whomever has done what they've needed to do properly, you can cover yourselves and make sure that you're still a viable business through increase of forecasts. So within every supply agreement, the quality agreement is the fraternal twin. I want to make sure that I say this clearly and concisely. The supply agreement in itself should be handled, the extraneous detail then placed on the shelf. The quality agreement is a living document. The agencies are expecting that both parties are looking at this document on a regular basis to ensure that you are following the steps that have been provided in there. So this is a document that has the utmost importance. It is a living document. Unlike the supply agreement, this should be looked at regularly. So the quality agreement outlines what two parties are, the acceptance criteria, the testing mechanisms, pose the barriers, circumstances. Example, if there's an error in the process, cannot be traced to either drug product owner or contract client. The client is being charged by the CMO for the batch. For example, you've got something that says that, well, we've met all the criteria, but the end result is still not a conformance. How do you charge for that? What do you do? What do you do? And we can discuss offline how you can handle some of these things. But the issue is you need to make sure that the quality agreement is addressing all of these issues, because the agency, we have seen the agencies, those of us who have been through the reading of every observation that the FDA provides, you have seen them come down on the side of the drug product owner on occasion, and you have seen them come down upon the manufacturer on occasion. The guidance they have currently given is they say they want seamless integration of both. That's why this relationship, supply agreement, quality agreement, is the utmost importance that you're getting. The quality agreement negotiation process should be understood, situation outlined in several, such as you either insure the batch completely, if there is no resolution decided, an independent third-party arbitrator can come in and look at this. The quality agreement, all of this can be housed within the quality agreement. How are you going to handle these things? Where there is no topic that anyone wants to discuss, the quality agreement should have an escalation path. You should be willing to do that, because once again, if you're in a relationship, you want to make sure you have a path forward. No one wants to go through the pain of taking life insurance, filing their taxes, but April 15th just rolled around and it happened again. The government wanted taxes, and those of us who don't want insurance, we had no choice, but we have to have insurance now. So the quality agreement, we have to make sure that this document is going through. It's not an if, it's a you have to do it. So in closing, you're going to have negative events regardless of whether it happens or your business or your vendors. The question is, how are you going to respond, and making sure that from a supply agreement that you're covered. Thank you.